going to.
Can you hear?
We can see your screen, John, but it's not actually playing yet. I think you've got to hit play.
Can you hear it now?
It is playing, but we can't hear.
Let's try again.
And we're still seeing the opening slide, cover slide.
Okay, so let's try again.
If you go to slideshow and say start at beginning, it might do it on the tabs at the top. I think you might just be playing one slide at a time, rather than the whole slideshow.
The experience of the young adults. Can you hear? Can you hear?
I can hear you, John, but I think you're playing one slide at a time. If you go up to slideshow in the top line of the tabs,
yeah,
and say yep, and then press slideshow play from beginning. See what happens.
Can you hear?
It's very quiet. Okay, in the chat, people are saying it was playing, but very quietly. Thanks, Luke. So we seem to still have some technical issues here. Sorry.
Yeah, we do. We had tested it out this morning with Diana. I don't know what's happened to her. But,
I've asked Diana if she can come back in and help us. You're a big tease, John.
Did I carry on?
Well, I don't think we can really hear what the recording is saying. We haven't actually got past the title slide yet.
I wonder why this is so low.
what if you, perhaps if you try the, is the sound on maximum on the bottom right? No, it's not. Okay, if you go, there you go. Can you raise the sound? You've got to get rid of, I don't know. You got it. Okay, this is looking promising. You might have to go, yeah, why don't you start us off on slide 2?
Any good? Ah,
John, do you want to just perhaps, instead of playing the whole presentation, just go through the slides and just give us some commentary on them?
okay.
Or, I mean, we don't seem to be able to hear the sound from the recording.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you very clearly, yes, but not the recording.
Okay. As I said in my introduction, the first slide, the presentation is in 2 parts. The first is on the experience of money, of earning and sharing in the household and amongst friends and peers, and in spending the money on consumer goods and on everyday life. And the second part of the presentation was based on research conducted this year in May, where I interviewed the young adults again, the research, the inquiry was about their experience of the COVID pandemic, and in doing so, we started talking about what had happened in the past 5 years, and what emerged from the research is the matter of their transition to adulthood and what adulthood means to them. But going back to the initial research, which was conducted in 2016, the core problem there that was at issues to account for how and why their experience of variable low-income intermittent employment impacted on their lives, the decisions they made about employment, the way they shared in the household, and how they spent on things that they want and need themselves. Methodologically, it was a qualitative case study of in-depth interviews, repeat interviews of 12 trainees. I worked with these trainees over a period of 6 months on a daily basis. There were 25 in total in the class. 12 volunteered for the in-depth interviews. But during the course of the 6 months, I had the opportunity to talk to all 25, to inquire about their opinions and regarding their behavior and the behavior of others and what happened in their lives. I also conducted 2 days of group work with the full group of 25. I gave them an opportunity to act out skits, which they had a short period to prepare in impromptu skits. They had about 10 minutes in groups of 3 or 4. They came back, they acted out these skits. We discussed what was meant and what the implications were, and there was a great deal of enjoyment and fun, and also quite a lot of serious discussion. So all of this was recorded and analyzed, and I discovered in this 3 seemingly paradoxical phenomena. The first is that they quit employment voluntarily, in spite of aspiring to earning and spending, and they chose to be unemployed, and they fell back to the household. They depended on the household to give them support, and the household in turn provided that support condition. The idea of contribution to the household is a very important relationship. They also, when they were employed, they spent money extravagantly on consumer goods, on the good life, which is drink and revelry. Not all to the same extent, but the aspiration was common, the aspiration to the recognition and to being someone in the world that consumer goods and lifestyle provided. Let me go on to the next slide. If I can get to it, here we go. I've covered this. The thing about this is, it was a qualitative case study, and the effects of employment are not, and the subject of lived experience of this experience of the young adults is not documented and studied, although it's quite a significant population that feels these, that has this experience, population of young adults. The young Black African working population spends a great deal of time in between jobs, in employment and out of employment. In 2015, if I remember correctly, the figures were out of 10 million young adults, or nearly 10 million young adults who were economically active. 6.25 were employed, and more than half of that 6.25 were employed temporarily or casually. So it's not a small figure, but at the same time, the same young adults find it difficult to leave the household. They're caught in this situation of intermittency, and they live in households which are economically vulnerable, and they also face pressure and temptation to conform to consumption, which is usually and mostly beyond their financial needs. They spend money that they have, and they buy on credit, and they feel a frustration of their advancement, which is caused by this prevalence of which I discern from the interviews of a negative self-experience. They expect to get ahead. They're expected to advance, and yet they feel stuck. So this is broadly the experience that they have, and I look at this experience in relation to the domestic moral economy. And the domestic moral economy is a place where Chris Gregory refers to as the place where virtue and vice meets profit and loss, and they form an inseparable whole. So money and relations of obligation and aspiration are entwined in this nexus of the household. And money flows in as earnings and flows out as spending. And it's a look at an economy in a different manner, in a manner in which the relationships of people are fundamental to their monetary exchanges and personal exchanges. I've talked about the paradoxical phenomena. I just want to show you the pattern of employment and earning. So you see these patterns. This is a sample of 6 of the young adults. They earn intermittently. They earn variable amounts over time. And the trend generally is downward or flat, and marginally increases more recently. I want to just give you a bit of a flavor of the qualitative data that I could draw from by just showing you some of these quotes from the participants. I try and use the quotes as much as I can, because I found that, in fact, these young adults are very aware of their circumstances, and they know and they analyze their circumstances themselves very well. So I've used the quotations extensively through the thesis. In this case, we talk about the relationship with the household, not being enough money or being held back and left behind. So we have a sense of time and the passing of time. We see the tensions in the household, in this case, the gendered take on the domestic economy. Keeping up with friends and on the expense in how they spend. And this idea of sacrifice I found quite interesting, that we go to bed, go to sleep having eaten pap, and yet you have to spend everything you have to look good and buy expensive whiskeys and so on. So from this 2016 research, I conclude in this slide, I contribute to the literature on moral economy an instance of a South African case of what Chris Gregory calls the inseparable hold of money in the domestic economy. The inseparable hold constitutes the involvement, as I said, of money earned and money spent in a dynamic of aspiration and relations of obligation in the domestic domain. I want to add, Carrier refers to the domestic, to the moral economy in this fashion, where money and the flow of money through the economy in question involves feelings of obligation. I want to add to that the feelings of aspiration, which are individual and collective in the household. So we have this interplay between obligation, responsibility, loyalty, and aspiration that relates to money. And this, I think, is the what I get from and my particular insight from this research is this understanding of economy in this fashion. In doing so, I critique in a very gentle fashion the idea of dependence as a solution, which Ferguson puts forward in his book, Give a Man a Fish. It argues against such a solution for those who are intermittently employed and episodically incorporated in South African capitalist production and reproduction. I argue that there's a certain complicity by capital in the stalemate that's created in this particular age cohort in the 20s and 25-year-olds, where they are drawn into the capitalist economy when needed and set aside when not. So what I'm advocating in this research is a stabilization, essentially, of the labor market. So I go on and I talk about the COVID pandemic, and young adults are affected, and in the presentation I give an account, a detailed account in the recorded presentation, a detailed account of what they actually experienced. But in fact, it can be summarized that they have people they know, as we all do, who have suffered the consequences of the infection, the COVID pandemic infection. But their main concern and their main anxiety is with regard to their employment status, and they fear this a great deal. So the question that the research asks is, what constitutes adulthood? And in effect, adulthood is the usual things that we anticipate and expect of having a job and getting a house and a car, the conventional adulthood. And what they in fact experience is what is regarded in life course theory as a non-standard life course trajectory, with changes backward and forward through the life course. And eventually they end up in a situation of precarious adulthood, and that's essentially where I want to end this rather disastrous presentation. Thanks, everybody. I didn't anticipate doing it verbally. I would have prepared differently. But anyhow, please ask the questions and let's have a conversation.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. And just by way of explanation to everybody, I'm sitting in a cafe, I'm afraid, so there might be some background noise. I apologize for that. John was expecting to give a recorded PowerPoint presentation, and we had some technical problems. So he stepped in and did it live. Thank you very much for doing that, John. We really appreciate it. So as John explained, his research is really looking at this group of originally young adults who are now not so young adults, looking at how they navigate through the domestic moral economy, how they, in a context of labor market precarity, intermittent employment, how they navigate the different demands on their money, and how they extract money from other members of the household when they don't have money themselves. And so that earlier this year, as John said, he re-interviewed his panel to see how they were coping in the time of COVID. And so I'm hoping we're going to have some questions and discussions. But one way of asking questions or comments is to put them into the chat, or you could simply put up your hand and I'll try and see you. We could start off with a question, John, about Ferguson. So you mentioned Jim Ferguson's work on Give a Man a Fish, which is an argument, a slightly complicated or nuanced argument in favor of something like a basic income grant, on the basis that the era of full employment has gone forever, and we have to find ways of organizing society that take the focus more on redistributing from those who have work. And this is not just South Africa specific. And you said you had a sort of a gentle criticism of Ferguson. And I assume by that you're meaning that you're engaging critically, sympathetically with his criticism of dependency. Dependency is more complicated than he imagines. Could you tell us more about that?
Dependency and interdependency is a way of life, and it involves people who are employed and people who are unemployed, who move into and out of the family household, and those who are employed are as bound into the household economy as those who are not. His idea, I found his idea of simplifying the distributional politics it basically is too lenient on capital. It's too lenient in that it absolves it from the responsibility of this highly disruptive mode of employment. I think that they need to move in the direction of a more stable employment. They need to, which will have a whole lot of knock-on effects on the ability of the individual to borrow, the ability to stabilize their own lives at a much earlier stage, and the ability to support others. So it's not a critique against basic income grant as such. It's why I say it's a nuanced critique is because I add to it to say, don't absolve which he tends to do in making his argument. Don't absolve capital from this responsibility, and make it more directly theirs rather than indirectly through the payment of taxes and the state. So I've written it more clearly than I speak about it, but I think that is quite an important addition to the literature. And but I think the point that I want to make, the main point in terms of addition to the literature is with regard to thinking about and opening up this discourse on moral economy, so that economy is not separated from the relationship that it has everything to do with, whether it's in the household or anywhere else, in where groups of people relate to each other. Money is present, and it involves loyalties and feelings of obligation and responsibility.
So we can come back to this if we have time, John. There is I don't know if you're looking at the chat. You've got the chat open. Yes. Pat Larker has asked a question in chat. I can read it out. Do any of your interviewees see anything wrong with their lifestyle choices? And do they know what corrective measures are required? What do your interviewees say when they're reflecting on their lifestyle choices? What do they say?
The most of the young adults I spoke to, in fact, all of them, feel that it's excessive, but they feel that they have to spend, they have to be part of the world, the life world that gives value to spending and living the good life. Now, this changes over time. When I re-interviewed the young adults in 21, they speak of that type of lifestyle. So now they're 5 years older. They're in their 30s and going on to their 40s. They speak of that type of lifestyle as the behavior of youth. So it's not something that continues. It's a way of being and relating at that time, amongst peers and friends. So the lifestyle choices are felt to be wrong, but they feel obliged to participate in those choices.
So, if I understand you right, John, you're saying that the ambivalence or even criticism that your interviewees are expressing about their former lifestyle choices, those that they're now more ambivalent than they were before, and you're attributing that to just the passage of time, that they are now older, not to any of the repercussions of COVID and lockdown. Do you think that COVID and lockdown had any impact on those shifting perceptions and attitudes?
The interviews that I had, let me think. There was a sense that there wasn't so much money to spend as before, but at the same time, they spoke of people going out in the street during lockdown and spending and whatever they had on drink and partying and so on. So on the one hand, they themselves were more conservative with the money that they had, because they now had new social roles as older people and children to take care of, and they were heads of household, and they had their own homes, but they spoke of people in the street who flouted COVID restrictions and drank whatever was available.
There's another question in the chat from Siraj Mohammed. Siraj asks, he says, thanks for that interesting presentation. Would you agree that because of the extreme inequality, young adults who are supported by affluent parents are treated as adults? while poor adults without secure incomes are not treated as adults. This idea is interesting because of the colonial and apartheid legacy, where many workers are still referred to as, quote, boys and girls. Perhaps how one's ability to sustain consumption affects perceptions of adulthood.
Thanks for that, Siraj. A key marker of adulthood is becoming a provider. If you're earning and you're a provider, you have the social attributes of an adult. You have children, you look after the house, you take care of parents, and that is to a large extent dependent on your ability to provide. If you can't provide, you're not in a position to act or be considered as an adult. So I'm not sure about affluent parents and their children, but in this case, being a provider is a key determinant of adulthood.
So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So if anyone's got a question, please record it, please write it, or put your hand up. But maybe, John, we could come back to Ferguson. So in Ferguson's basic argument was that in a world in which no one can be fully employed, we have to find ways of redistributing society's resources to everybody in a fair manner. He talks about rightful shares, but yes, he's ambivalent because he believes that at least in Southern Africa, having a claim to social resources must be done in some sense as a member of a community, not just as an individual. So then the question is, well, what constitutes an appropriate demonstration that you are a member of a community if you want to have a claim on resources? You seem to be engaging with this in two ways. Firstly, you seem to be saying that actually work rather than just income is important. And secondly, that simply redistributing income to poor households doesn't obviate the conflicts that might arise over the use to which those resources are put within poor households. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that one. Certainly, the sense that I get from talking to the young adults is that employment is preferred over income, over income that is earned at a spaza shop or by some other means where you're trading. It's more settled employment is valued over other forms of income. Money from child support grant goes to the individual mother or the caregiver, and it's given usually to the person who's taking care of the child. The old person's grant is generally shared in the household, more shared than the child benefit grant. And as far as employment income is concerned, it's the money that there's a contribution made, and it's fairly standard. From one household to the other, there will be different demands placed on the employed person, however they're employed, intermittently or full-time employed. There's an ongoing demand for contributions. But if you don't make your contribution, then you can't hold on to your place in the household very easily. you're tolerated for a time, and then things get more and more difficult, and then you're forced, as in the case of one of the young adults who eventually was evicted, a young man, and were told to go and live in an informal settlement. So it's not quite clear where the basic income grant will fit into the schema, because if everybody's getting a basic income, if it is indeed a unconditional grant, universal grant to everybody, it's not obvious to me how that will be played out. It's very likely that that a portion of that will be distributed and put into the pool of shared income. But I also anticipate quite a lot of tension between the household and individual members of the household and the individual contributor, because one has this ongoing dynamic between obligation to give and aspiration, and the aspiration is both individual by the individual household member, but also as a collective. It's a collective aspiration for progress. But this is a dynamic, and it's a dynamic in stress. It's not a dynamic that is comfortable. The giving is what Peterson refers to in Australia as this demand sharing. You know, it's you give when you're asked, rather than sharing voluntarily. And I have a whole discussion in the thesis about this phenomenon of sharing and mutuality, and the effects of this intermittent employment on those dynamics in the household. Yeah, I'm rambling on here, but that's a roundabout quick answer.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's your seminar. We've now got a whole bunch of questions in the chat. I don't think we can take them all at once. One set of questions relates to expenditures. And these questions have been asked by Luke and by others. And the question, these so-called wasteful or extravagant or excessive expenditures, are we talking about large amounts of money, or are they really quite small amounts? And can you say anything about savings cultures, and attitudes towards savings? Have they changed over time? I mean, how might one facilitate or encourage saving behavior, perhaps, amongst your poor households? And there's a second set of questions around the employment paradox you mentioned. Why this is asked by Helen? Why do people leave jobs when they've got, when their income is insecure? Why do they leave jobs and so-called choose unemployment? Can you say something about both of those?
Well, first, let me answer the leaving jobs, quitting voluntarily. They all of my young adults, the 12 that I interviewed in detail, have quit employment. In fact, in 35 instances of changing jobs, they were the 35% of the time, a third of the time roughly, of instances where the young adults moved on from the contract employment. Usually they left voluntarily. In other words, they quit themselves before the contract ended. But this is a curious phenomenon, as Helen has asked, in the light of their own ambitions, their own desires for progress, and also the consequences that it has on the household. And it's very simply because the money's too little for the effort that's put in. And they say that. The cost of getting to work is too high. The effort that one puts in and what one gets out, in fact, it's by the end of the first week, and I'm almost I'm paraphrasing here, by the end of the first week of the month, which is the month after they've received money, they have nothing. So they go to work and they have nothing to spend, even though they go to work, because they either owe money or they make contributions, or they spend it as quickly as possible before other people lay claim to it, or so there's this reluctance to accept the low wages, but at the same time they do. So you have these two things happening, where there's a quitting of employment, and that people will accept whatever they can get to avoid the boredom at home, to avoid the circumstances that they face every day in this situation of idleness. So these two things are happening simultaneously, and that's part of the paradox. The paradox is the quitting itself in these circumstances. With regard to saving, I think I've probably answered that question. This particular cohort, this particular group, tries to save, and they say they do, but circumstances and the need to spend, the desire to spend on things that are needed or wanted is just too strong. They can't prevent this. But I must say here also, there's a complicity in the retail and consumer finance sector. Not once, but in a few instances, I asked about credit cards, and credit cards are sent to the young adults in the post. And the one young woman said she sat with a credit card on the table next to her bed for 3 months, and eventually she gave in and went and bought, because she deserves it. So there's a push and a pull that happens on the desires and the wants of young people. And our level of indebtedness in this country amongst people earning less than 10,000 is very high. It's not only the external circumstances, but also internal social conditions which create this subjective condition. I see a question about aspiration, which I'd like to answer, and how I frame this aspiration. There's some literature, a particular piece of work that I took and used was by a man called Debraj Ray, who talks about aspiration in this dimensional way. He talks of aspiration as an aspirational window, which includes within the window all those who are considered to be within the range of aspiration of the young adult. The window creates the desire to move forward. There's a forward movement of want. But he also talks about the distance, the aspirational distance. So it's a window and a distance, and the distance changes over time. Its feelings it's the distance between the real life experience and the aspirational window. And sometimes that distance is felt to be too far away, and sometimes it's near enough to inspire and motivate the young adults to move towards their aspirational window. So there's a sort of, so that's one literature, one bit of reading. The other is Appadurai's collective aspiration that I look at. So aspiration is a forward movement. It's a movement towards something And also this aspiration causes anxieties, anxiety and worry about oneself in the present, and whether the future and how the future will materialize. So throughout this research, I observe this idea of time and movement towards. And when I was looking at the transition to adulthood and read back through the transcripts and the work from 2016, I saw time and the concern with time and getting ahead and falling behind and being achieving those aspirational goals as quite prevalent throughout the life course.
I think just one final question, if you've got thoughts on this, John, in the chat. Viv asks a question which is broadly, I suppose, related to what are the implications or the policy or perhaps of your research. Given what you've learned about the way in which money and work is experienced and by young-ish adults and how they navigate the domestic moral economy, what are the implications for either public policy or for the responsibilities of employers? Do you have any thoughts on that? Right, this is your last chance, your last
yeah. Well, I came upon some work on churn. I think it's Andrew Kerr, if I'm not mistaken, and then a few others in the literature. And South Africa's got amongst the highest level of economic churn, labor market churn in the world. People are in and out of employment quite substantially. So what that brings to mind is how does one actually stabilize? How does one go about stabilizing the labor market and thereby stabilizing social life of a substantial part of the population? And I think that what is needed is a heart-to-heart talk with business, where there are incentives and there are measures put in place to encourage and support a more steady employment, more stable employment, and where there is excessive temporary employment, to ask the question why, and maybe even set up some punitive measures against this type of behavior, because I think that this population that is intermittently employed is critical to the social life of very poor families, and it really puts the households at enormous stress. And this, I know I'm speaking of a particular cohort. It's not, universal across. I'm speaking of young adults, but young adults are prevalent in households all the time. And if this is what they're experiencing, what is needed is some measure of stabilization of employment. So I think that's really the conclusion of my research. It isn't really. I think that as a practical measure, I think also encouraging wherever possible to speak of and to think about this idea of moral economy. I've been thinking about it in other contexts of where the elite are involved in relationships of loyalty and responsibility to each other, and where money is in the room. I think there are moral economies at play in the corporate sector, amongst the political elite, amongst everybody, and we don't speak about that in this sort of way. and perhaps it's necessary to start doing that. And I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John, for sharing your research with us. Thanks to the audience for being here and asking questions. If anybody wants to contact John, please go ahead. We look forward to seeing everybody at the next CSSR webinar, which I think is in 2 weeks' time, and notices will be sent out as usual. Thank you very much, John. Thank you to everybody else.
Thank you.